Hello and welcome. I'm Johnny, I'm an engineer, and you want to use Tailwind with Next.js. Tailwind CSS burst into the website styling scene as the utility-first CSS framework. Nowadays, it has a more straightforward promise: rapidly build modern websites without ever leaving your HTML. They've just released a huge update with 2.2, and I think that promise holds truer than ever. I am a fan. And we have talked about Next before. We went through the setup needed for a brand new Next app, as well as a couple quality of life hacks. We'll be picking up from there today to set up Tailwind. We'll start implementing this Figma design I've put together, and we'll end up here. So only that call to action button really from the design, but it's because we'll be going over a couple React, Tailwind, general styling tips that will set us up for success going forward. Things like aliasing colors, extracting reusable components, maybe even semantic classes. We'll be discussing what that even means, but enough talking, time for doing. Let's go. So we've got our IDE, VS Code on the left, our app on the right. Let's add the dev dependencies we need for Tailwind. The embedded terminal, let's add npmi, -d, Tailwind CSS, Tailwind itself, OCSS, and auto-prefixer, the things Webpack will use behind the scenes to compile our code. Let's run npx Tailwind CSS init-p, which will create the two configuration files we need: post-css config.js, which we won't need to touch, and tailwind config.js, which we will. Let's enable just-in-time mode, which is much faster during development and allows us to use tons more Tailwind features. It's a matter of specifying mode JIT for just-in-time and specifying blobs for where our code containing Tailwind classes and other CSS is in this purge key. For us, that's every TypeScript or JavaScript or CSS file in the source directory. Remember, that's where we grouped everything in the last video, so do consider whether you've actually followed along or if you left the pages directory in the root, for example. In that case, you'd need a different blob pattern here. Alright, so that's our initial config done. Let's restart our dev server, as it doesn't know that we now wanted to read our new post-CSS config and the Tailwind config files. Great, no visual change, but no crashes either, so that's a win. Let's actually bring in Tailwind in our source code. Let's create a styles Tailwind CSS and import the Tailwind directives we need here. I like a separate file for this, for Tailwind stuff. This could be where we define composed classes, which supply many Tailwind classes together, but that's a subject for later. For now, let's go to our existing styles, global CSS, remove everything, and looks like we're back to a serif font. Cute. Let's actually bring in Tailwind by importing the file we just created, that CSS file. Alright, we can tell this worked, as we've now applied the style reset Tailwind brings in, which makes every browser apply the same base styles. But let's further prove it by adding a couple of those Tailwind utility classes we all love. Sweet. We've set up Tailwind, so critical mission accomplished. Amazing. Like and subscribe and all that stuff if you've already found the video useful, but stick around for a couple more critical tips. We will use them as we implement our CTA button and going forward. Let's start by nuking all existing styles. We'll be doing everything Tailwind style. Let's put our button here for now. Looks like we'll want white text against a cyan 400 background from the Tailwind palette. And this leads into the tip about color aliases. The client wants cyan to be her primary brand color today, because maybe in the last video it was orange, maybe in the next one it'll be who knows what, which is very expected. After you've got your app running, your brand out there, it will probably not be changing your colors that often, maybe not even once a year. But while you're trying to figure out your app, what your brand even is, that will be happening constantly. So what do? We've only got the one instance of brand color, so we could just change this background color from cyan to emerald, for example. But in the final design, we have many more instances of color. Just to illustrate the point further, let's make the footer have a slight emerald shade. And maybe this text to be dark emerald. So yeah, I can multi-select those, but what if they were in different files? I could always search and replace, but do you really want to change every UI file in your app whenever you change a color? Trust me, you don't. The much better alternative with Tailwind is to go into our Tailwind config and add some color aliases. We could extend the default palette with aliases, but I much prefer being explicit with it. Decrease the chances of accidentally adding random colors in our UI. So let's create a primary color alias. The name could be anything, something that makes sense to you. Could be brand, for example. We're doing primary. Let's bring in all the Tailwind colors and use cyan for this. Let's create a secondary alias as well. Put emerald in that. Let's add our grays and now some helpful utility aliases. I like white, transparent, and current. Of course, we need to actually use these aliases, so let's go back to source code. Let's pick and use primary everywhere. Let's now change our config. Nice. One code change, many UI changes. Consistent and dependable UI changes. I love it. I now see this as a borderline mandatory step. Technically, you don't have to do it. Practically, you have to do it. Trust me. And the next tip is in a similar vein. How can I do just one code change whenever I change my mind about something that appears throughout our design? To establish why this would be useful, let's finish implementing our button. We need some padding. Alignment, maybe a bolder font. Maybe we want bigger type on bigger screens, more spacing. Looks good. Cool. But what if we want to tweak the border radius? No problem when it's just the one button, but what if we had many? It's always fun to come up with sentences. Alright, so we want these call to action buttons to be consistent throughout our app. It's the same problem we had before we aliased the colors. Should I really be multi-selecting when I decide that maybe I do want transitions for the hover state? Am I certain I've updated every instance now? There are a couple approaches to this. One of them is based on more generic vanilla CSS. Another one is based on templating. How do you usually work with frameworks like React or Svelte or Vue? Let's use them both. So first up, Adam kinda calls this content agnostic components. I sometimes call it composed classes. Some even call it semantic classes. And to clarify, we are talking CSS classes here, nothing to do with TypeScript classes. Right. In any case, we've identified a pattern. We now have loads of buttons, and no matter if their text is different, if they do different things when pushed, we've identified that we've got a common button. It should look like this. So let's define that class. Our styles Tailwind CSS. That file is as good as any. So, .button, add apply directive, all the classes. Apply is a magic directive that PostCSS understands and Tailwind uses for this. We could call this button primary or CTA, doesn't really matter. Again, the name should be something that's not related to the content, but most of all, it must make sense to you. If .cta makes sense, you go for it. So let's use this class in our buttons. By the way, this approach also solves the problem of if I wanted to scroll horizontally through my code, I'd be doing Java, but I digress. So now, if we decide that we want to use the secondary background color for all these buttons, we can do this more easily. eyeball the border radius a bit better, shadows, just the one place to change, and a bit less markup in our HTML. Right, so approach number 2. If you are familiar with frameworks like React, you probably know that defining components in one place and reuse them all over your app is pretty much their whole foundation. So why are we not doing it that way? Well, we will. Let's do it. Let's extract one of these buttons out. In their own file. We actually want them to have their own custom copy, so let's use the children prop for that. In the future, we will want other properties as well, but that's for the future. Cool, let's now use this button React component for every regular HTML button. Sweet. And of course, we no longer need the bespoke CSS class. We may remove and add all the classes back here. Either approach works for ensuring we update all of our CTAs with the least effort possible. But I do prefer mixing both of these solutions, actually, so I will leave it like this. And of course, we have to end with making the button bouncy on tap. That's like the whole point of pressing a button. Let's do it. In theory, the just-in-time compiler means that we don't need to change the Tailwind config to enable the active variant or any other variant, but it is still in beta, so do try a server restart if something ain't quite applying. Woohoo! Perfectly bouncy, as all things should be. I hope you've had fun today, because this was it. We made it through the video. We set up Tailwind and went through a couple extra steps that will save us time. Let me know in the comments if you've got fun stories about changing a color palette or the look of every CTA or some of that type of war story. Or let me know what you'd like to learn. For the next episode, we will be implementing at least the hero section from the design, and we'll be using Tailwind UI to do it. So if you're curious about that, you only have to wait 1 week. And I'm sure I'll be including some general tips on implementing design, because I just can't help myself. In any case, thanks a bunch for your time. Have a lovely day. I'll see you around.